Again, firstly, thank you for taking the time to review this next webinar. As you probably are aware, just to reiterate, we're doing one of these every month. The purpose of the webinars is to spread the knowledge of the software. So we do various subjects, either functionality within the software or more technical aspects. Some of the previous ones have been a lot more technical. If you've missed them, they are on our website. You can go to datascopewms.com. You will find them under the webinars tab or under the videos tab. So the purpose of this one is to focus on the cycle counting module itself. Again, what we are trying to do here is demonstrate the functionality that exists, with the purpose that ultimately you can actually go and change the settings yourselves and make the software or optimize the software for your specific environment. Just some housekeeping things. You are able to post questions on the webinar, so please feel free to post questions as we go through. We will deal with them at the end. Yeah, then I think we can jump straight in. Obviously, presenting today will be myself, Anton, and Stephen. Stephen heads up the development team in South Africa. So let's just position it a little bit on the slide. We've put in a little image here just to kind of help persons to understand the application of cycle counting and how it changes or is slightly different in slightly different environments. We'll kind of refer back to this image as we demonstrate different functionality. But essentially, if you look at this warehouse in the image, there are essentially three main kind of focus areas where cycle counting would be slightly different in each of those three. The first one is in the main racking area across the back. So you may call that the bulk storage area, where you have pallets inside the racks. So your racks are bin locationed. Within the racks, you have pallets. Each pallet number, or each pallet has a unique ID, what we call a tracking ID. And it's a fairly uniform, clean area to count. Then we have sort of down towards the left-hand side of that image, we have a block stacked area where you can see some yellow lines on the floor. And in those bin locations, typically each one of those is a bin. You have multiple pallets inside the bin, and therefore, because there's multiple pallets, you would have multiple tracking IDs or license plates in each of the bins. So we count them slightly differently. And then if you look across on the right-hand side, we've got those little blue bins, which is depicting a typical pick face environment where you have many tiny bin locations or small bin locations, and you've assigned stock codes to those bin locations, and only that stock code or the limited range of stock codes that you assign to that bin are allowed to be there. And obviously cycle counting needs to ensure that you can never have a different product inside one of those bins. So we'll refer to the image as we're going along. Just down on the right-hand side, just the concept around a track ID. Most of you are clients, I can see, that are on here. So you understand the concept of a tracking ID. For those that are new, a track ID is kind of a level of data lower than Syspro would ever hold. So Syspro would hold the stock code in a warehouse, perhaps a lot number associated with it, and then down to a bin location level. But we hold a level deeper than that, which understands that within the bin, we have different track IDs. Those may be pallets, as an example, and each pallet has a single SKU on the pallet, or it may have multiple SKUs on the pallet. But the unique ID references that grouping of product. And that grouping could be, in most cases, a pallet, but it could be a drum, it could be a coil of wire, it could be a large carton, it could be a flow bin, it could be a big hopper. It doesn't really matter. The entity doesn't matter, but each entity would have a track ID, unique number, and we keep a history of everything that went into and out of that unique number. So just wanted to position that first, because obviously as we do the counting, the concept of counting a bin and a track ID is absolutely vital throughout. And if you misunderstand that relationship, the rest will become a bit difficult to understand. Right, so let's move on.
I think I'm going to kick it, Anton.
Yeah, so I'm going to hand over to Stephen. Stephen will go through the demonstration of the software in a fair level of detail, and then we'll sort of recap and then move on to the next section.
Okay, so on this slide, it's just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover when we hop over into the demo now. So we'll cover some basic counting, just in a very basic form, just to get the concept of the bins and the tracking IDs and actually how the process works right from the warehouse floor all the way through to SysPro. So we'll do that first. And then we'll have a look at some full bin counts and why that would be done and what a full bin count is. And then we'll do a couple of examples of that. Then we'll take a look at some of the settings. We'll go through a lot of detail in the settings, both system and warehouse settings. Just an overview of those settings and describing what each one does. And then we set up a couple of examples where we're going to manipulate those settings and show you how the screens and the process behaves as they change. And then we'll look at some of the reports as well as the limits. Okay, so I'm going to hop straight over into the software. Before we start counting, I'm just going to give you an understanding of the screens involved. So essentially, there's going to be 3 key applications we're going to look at. 2 on the mobile scanner or the mobile application, and then 1 on the PC side. So I'm just going to log into the system quickly. So what I've done on my operator is I've specifically set my operator up as a cycle count person. I'm in a group that's only got permission to the cycle count applications. So immediately on my dashboard, I can just see my 2 there, being the cycle count, actual counting, and then also we'll touch on the scheduled counting later. So if we go into cycle counting and we take a look at the application itself. So this is the mobile part or application that the guys will use on the floor. Obviously, multiple users can use this simultaneously. There's no locking of the application itself. So we can have a whole host of guys on the floor counting multiple bins simultaneously. So that's on the floor side. And then inside the actual PC client, what happens is those counts get posted through into an approval screen, which looks like this. And this is where a person will review them and then ultimately make the decision if they accept or reject those counts. So to show these in action, what I'll do is I'm going to do a very simple count where we're going to count a single pallet in a bin with a single pallet, just to get the ball rolling. So on the mobile application, we're going to scan, first of all, the bin. I'm going to ignore this message now. We'll touch on that in the more advanced section on full bin counts. So I'm just going to cancel that. Then it requests us to scan the tracking ID and then the stock code. Sorry, stock code. And then we have to put in our quantity and we can post that through. Keeping in mind, this is a very simple, straightforward count. And then we refresh the screen here. You'll see our count has come through there at the top. So I've got a couple of counts on the screen here, but I'm just going to touch on the one we've just done, which is this top one. We've got a captured quantity of 100 units. So that means we just put in 100 units. We've got a WMS quantity of 100, and it shows our variance on the WMS side, our variance in SysPro, our variance stock on hand, and our SysPro variance. So what it does is it compares our captured quantity to a stock on hand figure in both systems. Now, those stock on hand figures might be identical. In this case, on that particular line, all are in sync. So WMS and SysPro have the same value, and the captured quantity is also the same value. But we could have the case where only SysPro is out, or WMS is out, or they're both out, but they're out by different amounts. So the whole purpose of this is to get all two of those systems into sync. And then just to make it clear, what we're doing here is we're actually taking a snapshot of the stock on hand at the time he counts that bin. And it's quite important to understand that, because if someone came to that bin after he'd done the count, but we haven't done the acceptance, you can still take stock and put stock into that bin. You can manipulate the stock on hand in that bin without affecting the overall write on or write off that it's going to do. So that makes it quite nice that we're essentially not locking those bins down. Okay, so I'm just thinking that's not the one I counted. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly clear these counts and count it again, just so we have a single count in there. post that through to Syspro. So we refresh there. So I've counted a bit more now, so we've obviously got a variance. And then at the end of the screen here, we can accept and reject the variance. So I'm going to accept that variance and post it through to Syspro. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is quickly hop into Syspro and just show you the effect of that in Syspro, so we can see it coming through. We won't do this on all of the accounts. We just want to do this on the first one just to show you that that the information is coming through there. And we can see that the counts are being adjusted in the system here. You can see I've done a couple today. We've got different references coming through, and we can see the quantities being adjusted along with the journal numbers. That reference number you would have seen that came directly from the WMS screen over here when we had the reference here. We'll go into that detail later with the settings. And then just to quickly touch on the simple example, I'm in the same bin, but I've counted a pallet that already is in that bin. So I just wanted to show you what the software will do. So you happen to count a pallet that is in a different bin, for example. So in this case, I've counted a tracking ID, and the software understands that we're counting this 03 bin, 01A03. However, this tracking ID we've just counted is in 01. So you've got a couple of options there. You can either cancel out and move to that bin and go and count that bin. Or if the tracking ID is validly in that bin, it'll allow you to do a transfer by clicking OK. It'll do the bin transfer in Syspro and WMS, and you can go and count that bin as you wish. Okay. So that
I just got a quick question here from somebody that asked, when we did that count a minute or so back, the software never asked for a lot number. And just to confirm that the software obviously understands whether a product is lot traceable or not. If it is lot traceable, by default, it will stop and ask you to scan the lot number or enter the lot number. If it's not lot traceable, it simply just grays it out and moves on.
Yeah, for the purpose of this demo, we're using non-traceable stock, but the fields that Anton's talking about are this one here, the lot, and the expiry date. A couple of options around that. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is a full bin count. But before we go and actually do the count, I just want to come back to the image over here, the bottom left. It's the same image on the previous slide. But the purpose or the definition of a full bin count, basically what we just did is we counted an individual pallet. We just said, we're counting this pallet and we're telling you how much is on the pallet. However, if we're counting a bin in Syspro doesn't understand that there can be two pallets in that bin. It just understands the stock on hand of that particular stock code in the bin. So what would happen if we had the case if we had two pallets in the bin with the same stock on it? If we just did a straight count on the pallet of that A100 and we ignored the other pallet, we're essentially going to be writing that stock off without even knowing about it. Well, the review screen will show us, but we won't know why there's such a variance. So that's why we introduced what's called a full bin count. And what that does is it allows the operator to start a bin, count the bin, and once he believes he's counted everything in the bin, he can end the bin. And then the software does a net check and checks if there's any other stock that he might have missed that the system believes was there, and will add in system-based counts for a 0. In other words, allowing us to see where that stock is, or that stock exists, and it's going to be written off for those tracking IDs. So we'll just do a demo on that.
So, Stephen, can we just go back to the slide of the overall warehouse? I just want to point it out. So if you look at this particular layout, the bulk bin locations at the back typically would have a bin location for each pallet, right? So it's a nice and easy to count, right? If I scan the bin, I have one pallet in the bin. It's logical. It's laid out like that. But the pallets that are on the floor there are in those rows, like the block stack stuff. I would never ever want to go and scan a bin location and then just count one pallet in that bin, because the chances are if I've got that same stock code on a pallet right at the back of the same bin, I would be writing that stock off. And that's essentially just to try and put it in a more graphical situation. That's what we're dealing with here. So on bulk bins like this one, like block stack, you would typically always do a full bin count.
Okay, so we're going to go and do that now. So what I've got is I've got a bin that has got 2 pallets in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count just the one pallet and we'll do the end bin or the full bin count. So when we scan the bin, that message we saw in the very first one, which I said we ignored until later. What I'm going to say now is I'm going to say, okay, I want to do a full bin count. We do get a warning that the software has picked up that there's more than one pallet in that bin for the same SKU. So already we know there's potentially a danger that could have occurred. So we'll scan the tracking ID, the first one, and the stock code, and put in, say, 200 units, and post that. Okay, now, for example, let's say that the operator believes that bin is finished. He's counted everything. Physically, there's only one pallet there. So we'll click the end bin. Okay, so he's done with that bin. And then we'll refresh the screen here. So we can see here we've got 200 units. We've got quite a big write-off of 200. So if we take a look, we can see that we've captured this first pallet here under my name. However, there's another record there called system, which is where the system has gone and found another pallet, which is this 2044, and it's added a 0 count for that. So meaning it'll write that off. So then the guys can make a decision as to go and try and find that pallet. Maybe it's somewhere else, or they can say, no, validly, that can be written off. At least we can see that we're writing off that stock because of that particular pallet. What I'm going to do now is show you the screen. If we take this now and go and count that pallet and see what the screen does. Because what I said earlier is you can have a multitude of guys on the floor counting flat out. However, you've got this review screen, which is relatively static. So there's probably questions around how does the screen handle this new data coming in. So I'm just going to show you that quickly. So we're going to go and count that to 2044. I'm just going to do a straight normal count. I won't do a full bin countdown. Okay, 100 units. The warnings we're getting here are because we're counting this pallet that's already been counted by the system, because there's a system count in there. So it's saying it's already been counted as 0, but that was obviously by the system and not by me. We'll post that through. So say, for example, we don't refresh my screen here, and we say, well, the operator doesn't know that there's more counts have come through, but he's happy with this, and he goes accept the count and post it through to Syspro. As soon as we do that, what happens is there's a net check that happens across those bins, and we check if there's any new counts have come in subsequent to him loading the screen or the operator loading the screen, and those lines are then highlighted in yellow. So this is saying you can't post until you refresh the screen, which we're going to do quickly. If we refresh that, we should see our new count coming through for that second pallet. So you can see the pallet come through, and then we can obviously go and process that through now. So that was kind of just a brief overview of a full bin count and how the system manages those scenarios, as well as how the multiple operators pushing through to this application. There's one last thing that I want to just show on the locking. If we try and open up another approval screen, we're going to get a warning here. And what we do is we actually lock down each warehouse when this screen is opened. So when an operator starts working on a particular warehouse, using this review screen, it gets locked to that operator. So we can't have two people managing cycle counts or accepting cycle counts at the same time for the same warehouse. So you can do them you can do it at a warehouse level, but that just prevents us from duplicating the records or duplicating the work.
Just to be clear there, you can have multiple people counting, of course. You can have 50 guys out there on the floor busy doing cycle counts. Those are coming through into that screen. If you refresh the screen, you'll see the data coming through. You can accept them as the guys are counting on the floor. There's no issue there. But what we don't want is we don't want an operator or two operators to open the review screen at the same time and they start fighting with each other in terms of actually approving different counts from two different screens. That we want to manage. There's just a question here which I'm going to touch on now. It's just around serial tracking. So the question is, if we're doing a cycle count on a bin for a product that is serial tracked, how do we deal with that? DATASCOPE does not support Syspro serial tracking. We have our own serial tracking module. We obviously support lot traceability throughout. From a Syspro serial tracking perspective, in our development cycle for 2021, in our roadmap, we are intending to build the first portion of serial tracking, which will obviously manage serial tracking, but only on the outbound side. So in Syspro, when you set up a product and you make it serial tracked, you can do it in two ways. You can either say it's serial tracked all the way through, so you need the serial number at receiving, wherever you move that product, or you can actually just say it's outbound serial track, which means that you only at the time of picking want to define the serial number and record the fact that that serial number went onto this particular picking slip, onto that order, to this customer on this date. So the first portion of that will actually be that outbound serial tracking, and that will come in later in this particular year.
Okay, so the next section that I want to cover is just to run through some of the configuration options. So we've seen a very basic count and we've seen a full bin count, but there's a lot of options that can be configured that change the way in that process works. They're broken down into either system settings or warehouse settings. I'm going to cover both now, and we're going to there's a couple more than I'm going to go through, but we're going to go through the most relevant ones that are applicable to the processing of the system, or the process flow of the system. Okay, so the first one that I'd like to cover on is a system setting, and it's this one in particular here, clear tracking ID after post. So if we take a look at the screen, one of the things we're scanning here is obviously the tracking ID, and then we go through the screen, and once we post, you would have noticed that it went straight back to the tracking ID field and cleared that field. What this setting does is it allows you to turn that off. So it allows you to stop that. So if we turn that setting off, what will happen is instead of clearing the tracking ID, it'll come back to the stock code. Now, the reason that's useful is that if you have a pallet that has got a lot of stock on it, and we'll switch back to that warehouse we looked at earlier, if we have a pallet with a lot of stock on it, then the software will allow us to scan the tracking ID once and then post each stock code, and we don't have to keep scanning the track ID. So it saves that additional scan of tracking ID every time. So we're not going track ID, stock code, and quantity post, and repeating that. We're going stock code, quantity, stock code, quantity. So it just simplifies that process if that's required for that particular pallet. Okay, so that's the first setting. The next one is the number of cycle counts that we show on the screen. So this pertains to the review screen that we looked at. So this is the approval screen. So this screen can get quite cluttered with the amount of information. If you have a lot of guys on the floor, say 30 guys posting cycle counts, it can get a bit overwhelming, first of all, on refreshing this and also seeing the volume of data. So it's a bit difficult to manage. So what we let the guys do is limit it down to 10. He can review his 10, process those, and accept them. It also makes it quicker that if he's refreshing the screen quite often, he's not loading a whole bunch of data down to the screen every time. He's just seeing that set of information that he can manage or work with. So it speeds up the process and also makes it easier on the screen.
Obviously, if he defines it as 10 or 20, then we'll give him the 10 or 20 records. As soon as he approves them and refreshes, those records drop off and the next 10 or 20 appear. It just helps the guy to review the data in a simple format. If you sat there with 250 records in there, what will tend to happen is that the approval guy will go all the way down his 250 records, but the problem is as he's doing it, more people are counting all the time. So it becomes quite difficult to manage. Certainly by setting that limit to 10 or 20, he's kind of reading those 10 or 20, posting them through, approving them or rejecting them, and it's a lot easier to manage.
Okay, the next one is the SysPro reference, and you would have seen this when you looked at the SysPro movements. I've still got them open here. This reference field here, that can be customized at two levels. First, at a system setting level, so we can change the setting that I was showing you there. And that will then, obviously, when they count the item and we accept it, it'll go through into SysPro and it can be tracked. So if you're doing a specific count for a specific reason, you can change that, do the count and change it back. It helps you with reporting in SysPro. We can also change it on the acceptance screen. I've still got some counts in here. You can also actually change it on the fly before you accept the count. So the standard one comes through there and I can go and type in whatever I want there. And post that through, and that'll change that reference for that particular line if you want to. Okay, that's that one. And then validate pick face destinations. This setting here is used for our dedicated pick face locations where we have a specific SKU that lives in that bin. And what it allows you to do is if you switch that on, when they do cycle counts in that particular bin, if they try and count stock code that hasn't been set up to live there, it will block them from doing that. Some of these settings that I'm going through now, we're going to do some example demos directly after I've gone through all the settings. So we'll see some of these in action shortly. And then the last one on the system settings that I'm going to touch on is the lower and upper value limits. These are basically our write on and write off limits. So we can set a value limit as to how much this operator can accept. So one of the columns in the grid here you'll see was the value of the syspro variance. There it is over there. So this particular column here, that'll obviously be a negative or positive, depending on if it's a write on and a write off. So what we can do is we can configure that bracket, if you want to call it that, to write off and write on. So the particular operator can only write on and write off that amount. If they go outside of that variance, they're going to need a supervisor to override that. And it's permission based. So if you have permission, you're allowed to override it. For example, if I refresh this, I'm outside of the tolerance. This message here is saying to me, there's counts that are outside of that variance. Do you want to accept that? Because I already have the permission, it's just warning me and letting me continue. If I didn't have permission, then the process would do this. You would still be able to see the line, but it would be grayed out. And you couldn't action that. If he wants to action that, he'd need to get a supervisor to go and put in the operator code. It'll log in, verify the permission, and then allow them to accept those counts. So that's the upper and lower limits. Okay, so that's the system settings. There's a couple of warehouse settings, 4 of those. So these are a bit more granular and make more sense to be configured at a warehouse level. The first one is auto load details. Now, this one exists on a couple of our applications. StockTake also has this setting. But basically what this does is allows us or the software to drive the operator through a particular bin. So instead of when we get, if we look at the scanner here or the mobile application, once you've scanned the tracking ID, the stock code, it was stopping at the stock code, expecting me to scan the stock code. The auto load will automatically pick up the first stock code and request a quantity. Once we post the quantity, the software will load the next one, and then load the next one, and it will loop through the entire tracking ID until we've counted everything it believes is there. We'll then get a prompt that allows us to add more items or to move to the next track ID. I'm going to demo this one shortly too, so we'll see that one in action. Then we've got a show quantity, which probably is seldom used, but it can be useful in some cases. Basically what this does is it shows the operator what the current quantity on hand for that particular pallet is. So again, if you came down here, when we got to quantity, it was a blank empty field, and we had to put in the quantity we believed was there. If you want to show them what we believe is there, or the system believes is there, you can set that setting on, and it'll show you the quantity. Again, it probably wouldn't be used very much, but there are specific cases when it will be.
So mostly that is not used, right? There are 1 or 2 clients that will do a full stock count or cycle count on all bins, let's say once a month or once every 2 months. But what they do is they'll do a blind count, and then the next 2 months afterwards, they'll actually show the quantity. It's more of an audit than an actual count. So it's not normal, but there are guys that use that.
The next one is to force a full bin count. And that's obviously what we looked at earlier. When we had that pop-up, it was optional for the operator to choose if they were going to do a normal track ID by track ID count or a full bin count. If you want to, you can force a full bin count. So if we look back at that image that Anton had at the beginning, in some areas here, you might want to specify that they force a full bin count to make sure that the stock is correct or counted correctly. And then the last one, which is a relatively new one, is called prompt for recount if the count doesn't match the stock. So basically, it's a watered down version of the showing the quantity. We're just telling the operator that what he's entered doesn't match what the system believes is there. And then the operator has a choice to either physically recount and enter the value again, or to accept what he put in. So it's kind of a warning to the operator saying that what the value he's entered doesn't match the current records. Is he sure he's right? So that's just kind of a prompt that we can turn on and off. Okay, so the first example we're going to do basically involves some of these system settings. So I'm going to quickly hop over to those settings. So what we're going to show you The first one is we're going to have a look at, let's just get to the settings here. Sorry, I'm going to do warehouse settings first. So let's get into warehouse settings. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to switch on auto load. So I'm going to turn that on. And I'm also going to show you SockGuard show quantity, just so we can see that working. Okay, so I'll switch those on. What I need to do now is just quickly sign out of the scanner, because when we change system settings or warehouse settings, we need to log out and log in again.
Is this a question here on the recount option that you just talked about? The question is whether we have this functionality in the stock take module. Just to answer that, no, not at this point in time. It's a brand new setting. It was actually just added in our last development sprint. So it's certainly something that we could possibly push into the stock take module as well.
Yeah. Okay, so what I've got here is I've got a pallet that has got, well, sorry, a bin that has got 2 pallets. Keep in mind the settings we've turned on is the first one is auto load. So we shouldn't have to scan the stock code. The software will drive us through the stock codes. And then second thing is we've turned on showing the quantity. So we should see the quantity of each of those pallets being shown up. So I'll do the bin first. I'm not going to do a full bin count. Now, as soon as you scan the track ID, you'll see instead of stopping at stock code, it's gone straight down to quantity and it's put the quantity in there. So I don't even need to change anything. If I believe the quantity is correct, we can just post it. And immediately when I post it, the software loads the next stock code and the quantity obviously shown again. We can post that one. And this is what I meant by once the software believes you've counted everything, it gives you the option to either move to the next track ID because you're done, or you can cancel and you can actually then add additional stock codes. So for example, there was an additional code on there, you can add that code on and accept that.
So if I can just add something on there, there's a question around that showing the quantity, and the question is, well, if we show that there should be 100, but the guy actually sees that there's only 80 there, I mean, what does he do? So in a case like that, all he simply does is he overrides the 100 with 80 and posts it, and we will obviously transact a net write-off of 20 units.
Yeah.
I want to also just mention that showing the quantity is very, very abnormal. So what we were showing there is 2 things. One is defaulting the stock code, and the other one was showing the quantity. So many companies that have, where you're running in a situation where the pallets that you have in your warehouse have more than 1 stock code. And we have a large number of clients like this, right? So let's take an example. One of those is cosmetics. In a cosmetics environment, they're very high, it's fragrances, it's very expensive stuff. So a typical pallet will have anything from 10 different stock codes up to 40 or 50 different stock codes on a bulk pallet. Now, in a case like that, they certainly want to turn that setting on. And what it basically does is every time they count a pallet, they scan the bin, they scan the pallet, and then the software is saying, you've got product A here, counted. You've got product B here, counted. You've got product C here, counted. That's what we're trying to achieve here, right? So for a warehouse that only has a single SKU on a pallet, doesn't make any sense. In a warehouse that maybe has only 2 SKUs on a pallet, in some cases, you probably wouldn't turn it on. But for warehouses where you regularly have 10 or 12 stock codes on a pallet, it's a very helpful setting.
Okay. So what we're going to look at now is going to do another example. We're going to change some different settings. So I'm going to set my auto load back to no, and I'm going to turn the show quantity off. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set this setting here, the prompt. So that's, as I said, similar to the quantity, but it's obviously the operator doesn't know what the quantity is, but it'll warn him. So we'll apply those 2. And then one system setting that I'm going to change is the one around the validating of the pick face. So let me change that. So I'm going to say here, validate pick face destinations. So I'm going to switch that one on too. Okay, let me log out here. Right. Okay, so this time what I'm going to do is count a pick face because we've set the setting on to validate the pick face destination. So there's two things I want to show here. First of all, we're going to show the validation of the pick face, and also not setting related now, but pick face related. If we scan a pick face bin, the software automatically knows in the background it's a pick face. And the way we typically design the pick face locations is the bin and the pallet have a matching number. It's very seldom that isn't the case. So what the software does is it doesn't ask the operator to scan the tracking ID, because typically when you get to a pick face bin, it's just got a bin label and there's no track ID labels. It's just a bin with your obviously your stock in it. So they would, if we had to ask them, they'd have to scan the bin and scan the bin twice because the bin is equal to the pallet. So what we do is we automatically default that in the software. So this pick face has got a configuration of A100. In it, I'm going to scan A200. And what we get is we get a pop-up that says it doesn't live in that bin, that pick face location, and actually gives us the location it does live in. So it immediately warns the user, and it doesn't allow him to obviously count that bin, and that's based on the setting.
It's also very helpful that we show which bin that product does belong in, right? Because obviously sometimes in a pick face, the incorrect stock code is actually, the incorrect product is in the bin. So we tell you, no, you can't count that, doesn't belong there. But actually it is configured in this bin. So the guy can take the product out immediately, take it to the correct bin and go and count that bin.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to select A100 and then I'm going to put in 500 units here. And now you'll see when we hit the post button, we're getting this warning here. It says the count doesn't match your inventory records. Click OK to recount. So he can stop here and go and physically recount and make sure his 500 is right. If he's happy with the 500, then he can say cancel, and it will continue and post that item through. So it's quite a nice setting that that allows you to kind of just prompt the user to do rechecks. Yeah. Okay, then the final ones we're going to take a look at. Settings are, I just want to set the those two warehouse settings back so we don't confuse things. Turn the prompt off. I'm not going to prompt anymore. Turn the validate pick face destinations off as well. Oops. And then the last one I'm going to do is this clear tracking ID so we can see that one in action. Quickly log out and log in.
Stephen, you've turned a clear tracking ID off, right? Or on?
Clear tracking ID? No. So it's going to keep the tracking ID there. If you looked at the ones we've been counting up until now, once we posted it, went right back to the tracking ID and cleared it up. So I had to scan that every time.
So while you're opening that, let me just explain to the team. Basically, what that allows us to do is, normally speaking, I would always go scan the bin, then scan the pallet or tracking ID, and then count the product, right? But in a warehouse where I have, is this the product one, Stephen? Just to be clear.
Yes, we're gonna be scanning multiple products here.
Yeah. So in a case where I have generally speaking, my pallet has multiple SKUs on it, I want to now come to the bin, scan the track ID, the pallet, okay, and then I want to scan stock code, quantity, stock code, quantity, stock code, quantity, without having to rescan the pallet all the time, right? So again, this only really applies to warehouses that have multiple SKUs on a pallet, but some warehouses have many SKUs on a pallet, and it's very irritating to scan the bin, scan the pallet, scan the stock code into the quantity, then scan the pallet again, and then the stock code, and scan the pallet again, and the next stock code. So this is just a slight adjustment, but it makes quite a big difference on the floor.
Okay, so I've got a tracking ID here, which has got two stock codes. So I'll just scan. Won't do a full bin count. So we only have to scan the track ID once. Obviously, its auto load is off now, so I need to specifically select the stock code there. And now when we hit post, you'll see it's going to go back to the stock code field. So instead of having to rescan that track ID each time, obviously we just need to I don't know which quantity I did now. We don't have to obviously rescan the tracking ID each time. So it's a small thing, but it improves both accuracy and speed. So it makes quite a big difference on the floor. The guy's not having to make mistakes and scanning the wrong track ID, as well as not even having to scan it. So it speeds up that process quite considerably. Okay, so that's, I think, the last example on that section. Anton, I think you want to just give a recap here.
Yeah, so just maybe just pull the whole slide up. Just very quickly, I just want to recap. So we showed a very basic cycle count. You can walk out onto the floor, it's live. There's no need to be able to lock a bin, unlock a bin. You can count any bin at any point in time. Even if you are, other products are coming into that bin or out of that bin, the net effect is when you accept that count, even if it's 2 or 3 hours later, it only does the net adjustment. So the bins are 100% live, quite simple to go out and count. Then we showed a full bin count. So, when there's multiple pallets inside a bin, doing a full bin count, the system automatically writing off anything that you didn't count. And then we went through a whole bunch of settings, which I'm not going to go through again. We've gone through that in quite a bit of detail. So, that's just a little recap. We'll move on to the cycle count scheduler now. So we've rebuilt the cycle count scheduler completely. We originally had one, but it was quite limited. We built a brand new one. You'll see it in the later versions. I think it came out about the middle of last year, 2020. And basically, this allows us to go and schedule counts for the year or period of time. And we can schedule those counts by bin, by stock code, or by lot. Right, and there's slightly different logic between them. In a very simple environment, we would take our warehouse and schedule out bin counts to count all the bins across the whole warehouse in a year, as an example. But there are times where I may want to schedule a count of a particular stock code. So maybe I go and find all my A running items, fastest moving items, and I schedule counts for those actual stock codes. So Stephen's going to show us the bin count first, and then we'll look at a stock code count and how those work.
Okay, let's get across here. Okay, so for this one, we're going to open up the cycle count scheduler advanced. Okay, so as Anton mentioned, there's a couple of levels. So on the screen, those levels essentially are filtered out here on the left. We've got three of the different levels: bin, stock code, and lot. And then finally, the actual review of what is currently in the schedule. So the first one we're going to do is just a very basic one where we're going to load up some bins. I just want to make sure we've got enough.
Just while Stephen is busy with that, what you can see as we're going into those bins is a bunch of filters, and those filters are very dynamic. I mean, you can. So the idea here is that you essentially go and find a filter out on any bin locations that you want using whatever filters. We are only going to go and say, get me a range of bin locations and put them in the schedule. But you could use a combination of any of those filters to filter out data which you want to put into the schedule in as granular as you would want to do that.
Okay, I've just done 3 in this example. But I mean, you would typically go and select maybe three rows or 3 racks in the warehouse and pull them into this grid first. And then you need to do 2 things. The first is we need to allocate how often they're going to count. So we'll go into the allocation here. So there's a couple options. The first is when we're going to start the schedule. So when does it start? Are we going to count on a daily basis or on a weekly basis? So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, this one's going to start, say, on the 18th. We'll do a weekly one. We'll count on Mondays, and we'll do, in this example, maybe just 1 a day. I know it's not that practical, but just to conceptually see what it does. So what it'll do is it'll add those counts in and allocate the dates there. So if we had a big range of bins and we went out for, say, I don't know, we did 20 a day, 20 on a Monday. Every Monday we do 20, it'll allocate those dates out. And then the operators will obviously come in on the mobile scanner and action the batch for that Monday. So once you've done that, we'll allocate them to the schedule. And then we can go and have a look at the schedule. If we just run this here, you'll see they've gone into the schedule now, and it's listed the bin locations.
So the idea is that you would go into those filters, you would pull out different sort of criteria, and you kind of add them into the schedule as you go, right? You kind of build your schedule up.
No, I mean, you can go to the nth degree there. There's a ton of filters on each of these. You can see all the bin ones, and we'll touch on the stock code ones now. Then just to have a quick look at it on the mobile application. Obviously, we're going to go into the schedule application now on the scanner or the mobile device. And if we just refresh this, we should see our bins. Okay, so the bins have come up here. So these counts are currently available and ready to be actioned. As soon as the operator clicks on one of these with their finger, it'll allocate that count to their name. So if we quickly refresh this in the background, you'll see immediately those counts become in progress, and it allocates it to a particular operator, which we can see over here. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to go and action this one. So that's the first bin. Let's get that here. So what they do in the same count that we were doing before, essentially exactly the same screen, is they need to go and can do that count. Let's do 100, post that through. That's warning me that that's the inventory warning. That's fine, I'm going to accept that. And then if we refresh there, you can see that item, particular one, has gone to complete. It's gone through to the accept and reject screen, where the operator will need to obviously accept and reject that. But from a schedule perspective, it's complete. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is the process from a bin perspective. It's relatively straightforward and understandable. When it comes to stock codes and lots, the concept is a little bit different. Obviously, because we don't know necessarily where those stock codes exist, so we can't pre-allocate bins that need to be cycle counted right up front when we build the schedule, because in 6 months' time, when the guy gets to count them, those bins, probably that stock doesn't even exist on those bins anymore. So what happens on the stock code and the lot one, we'll allocate the stock code into a schedule, and the information is stored against that schedule. And then as soon as the operator actions it on the scanner, that he's ready to go and count it, what the system does is it'll go and do a query across and find all the locations that stock exists and load up those bins that he needs to then go and count. So it's to make sure that when he's doing the count, it's relevant to the time frame that he's actually starting to do the count, not when we actually created the schedule. So we'll do an example of that so you can see how that fits together. I'm just going to do a single one here of A100.
Even have you selected stock codes? Look like you're in bins.
No, I'm in stock codes at the moment.
Oh, you are?
Yeah. Yeah, it's at the top, you can see.
Yeah.
Let's load that to the grid. Okay, so we've got A100. And again, same process. We'll go in here, say we'll do weekly, Mondays, I don't know. We'll do allocate. Okay, and then we add it to the schedule. Okay, then if we go and look at the schedule, it'll be slightly different this time. So last time you saw that it loaded all the bins for each of the bins that we had in our bin grid was added to this grid. In this case, just the one line has been added for the stock code. So there's no bin allocation yet.
Just
that will come when we
pull that across, Stephen, so that we can see the beginning of the grid.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oops.
I just want to point out that the count type, that schedule type is different. So there's a schedule type for a bin and there's a schedule type for a stock code.
Yeah, we can go and drill into those and separate them out. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll take a look at this on the mobile device. So I'm going to just go back to the schedule here, do a quick search. Okay, so there we can see the schedule type is stock code. So what will happen now, as soon as I click on this, the system is going to do a quick query, and immediately it's taken that stock code and given us a number of bins that it's calculated. And if you look at the schedule now, if we refresh this, we'll see that split has happened on the stock codes here too. So we can see that it's gone and done a query and says, okay, based on your current stock on hand, that stock code lives in these 5 bins or 6 bins. And then it actually allocates the tracking IDs and everything in here that he needs to go and then count. So we'll run through this quickly.
Just to touch on there's a setting in the background as well that limits the amount of counts given to somebody. Because obviously if you took a very high running product and you said, okay, I want to do a stock count, scheduled stock count on it, it might come back with a list of 250 bin locations that you've got to go and count, right? Which is impractical to count. So it would bring the 250 into the grid. but it would only allocate a limited number to the first guy. So let's say it's set to 10. It would go and fetch the fact that there is this product in 250 bins, but as he starts, it would just give him the first 10. And the next guy coming in would get the next 10 and the next 10. So you kind of split it out, which just helps you to manage products that are in many bins.
Yeah, all I'm doing now is I'm running through these ones here as I count them. I'm going to refresh the screen in the background so you can just see what's happening. Essentially counting all those bins that that were allocated. So as he's working through the schedule, you'll see that it's allocated obviously to my name, and you can see that which ones he's counted and which ones he hasn't counted yet. So we'll just finish it. Which is the last one. Okay, this is the pick face location.
So there's just a question, is there any way to actually allocate specific counts to a specific operator? No. When you build a schedule, you're building the schedule of all accounts that need to go in there. The operator on the scanner essentially opens up the scheduled cycle count screen and sees all accounts that are there available to be counted for that specific warehouse. He can filter that down. In other words, he can say, well, I actually want to only look at the counts that are there for in this warehouse, in this particular area or zone of the warehouse. Then we'll only show him those ones. And essentially then he picks them and he starts counting them. So just to answer that question.
Yeah, this is the filters that Anton's talking about. You've got a warehouse type and also the different count types here, which you're going to touch on, I think now, Anton.
In a minute.
Across the slide.
Okay, cool. So that shows us the count. Perhaps, Stephen, if you don't mind, just open the review screen, the normal approval screen, and just refresh it, just to show that all those counts have come through. I just want to reiterate the fact that the schedules the count, sends it to a scanner screen for people to manage those counts, but the actual counts themselves all come back in here, right? So the approval process is exactly the same approval process with the same settings, etc. On the schedule. Okay. Then just to go back to wrap up, we've got about 7 minutes left. So we've looked at schedule counts. I want to talk around triggered counts. So you will have noticed that the count type in all those ones that we were doing now were scheduled count types, right? They've been scheduled in. We have a different one called triggers, right? And triggers basically can be triggered from different parts of the application, but the main one is from the picking screen. So Stephen will open a picking screen now and just show us how this works. But essentially, during the picking process, when a picker gets to a bin location and sees there's an obvious issue with that bin. So on that screen by default, when he's busy picking, we actually tell him what the quantity is currently in the bin that he's picking from, right? So you'll see that available quantity at 0 at the moment because we haven't selected a bin yet, but normally it will show you, okay, on this product there's 200 in the bin. Let's say the picker's coming to pick 10. He says the software thinks there's 200 in the bin, looks there and says it's obvious there's not 200 in the bin. There's a whole pallet load in the bin, right? What that picker does is he simply clicks that little button called AS, which means assign to schedule, right? So as long as he clicks on that, it will say, do you want to add this bin into the schedule? If he says okay, it puts it into the schedule straight away. But the type that it goes in as is a triggered count, not a scheduled count. And then typically what we would have in a big warehouse is inside the cycle count team, you would have somebody who always prioritizes triggered counts first, because triggered counts essentially mean that we definitely have a problem. We've confirmed we've got a problem in that bin, and we would obviously want to go and find those triggered counts and get those counts done as quickly as possible. So that just touches on what a triggered count is. Then we've got some additional things around triggering accounts, right? We've built 2 brand new business objects. Okay. In other words, So from a third-party application or some sort of customization, we can use one of two of these business objects to either actually post a count or to post a count into the schedule. So the post account is an actual count, right? I stop the user, I ask him to do a count in the bin, and I use the business object to write that straight back into the review screen, right? The schedule count obviously puts it into the schedule, right? And I just want to talk around two that are currently being done at the moment. So just to take a little step back, obviously the new scanner screens are all HTML5. As we've mentioned in previous workshops, the key aspect of the HTML5 screens is I can copy them away. I can use the design kit to go and add logic into the screens and make them as intelligent as I want to do, right? And in two cases, two different sites are currently doing these two customizations. So the first one is an intelligent countback. So what they're doing is they're taking the normal picking screen, copying it away, creating a custom version for it, and they're building a little bit of logic into the screen that says, as soon as the picker comes to pick from a particular pick face or from any bin, it comes to pick from a bin, do a check on the bin, and if the bin has less than 50 products, okay, then pop up and ask him to do a count back. In other words, we're actually stopping him and we're saying, please count this bin, right? Now, we don't want to do it on every bin because he might get to a bin location where there's 15,000 products in there, and then we pop up and say, please count the bin. He'd never get his picking done. But in a simple scripted logic, we can say what quantity is left in the bin. If there's 50 or less, pop up something and say, please count the bin. Now that please count the bin in the background calls the post business object and writes the cycle count immediately straight into the cycle count, a completed cycle count waiting for approval, right? The second one's similar, but a little bit different. In this particular case, what this one does is whenever we pick from a bin, if the software believes that the bin is now empty, in other words, he picked the last product out of that bin, there's no more product left in the bin, okay, then we want to pop up with something and say, well, is this bin now empty, right? And if the user says, yes, it is empty, okay, and we believe it's empty, we do nothing. But if the user says, no, it's not empty, okay, then we automatically call the schedule business object and write it into the schedule as a triggered count. So please send somebody there to go and count that bin. And this can be done in a number of different ways. For instance, we can link this. So you could take your picking screen. There's a button on the picking screen called skip. Okay, most of you are aware of it. So if a guy needs to pick something, gets to the bin, the product isn't there for whatever reason and clicks the skip button, again, I can very easily put some scripting in there that pops up the same logic that says, oh, is this bin empty, right? And if he says, yes, it is, then we know we've got a problem. And again, we push it automatically into the cycle count schedule. So just touching on those points over there, these are more customizations, but we are encouraging clients more and more and more to build that logic into their screens, to do a bit more clever prompting on cycle counting so that it becomes more of the process as opposed to kind of something that's scheduled out. Okay, so that covers what we want to cover. We've got 1 minute left. I've got one or two questions here I just want to address quickly. Okay, there's a question just around the reporting on counts, on counts that have been completed. Yes, there are. We probably don't have time to demonstrate them to you, but you will see under the PC-based application, there's a section called reports, and there's some very nice reports in there to look at the history of approved counts, how many were approved, how many were rejected, et cetera, et cetera. So you can pull up a lot of the history of the counts there. So the next question is just on that pop-up message that says the count that you've just done doesn't match the inventory records, please recount. The question is, if it's a scheduled count, can that still apply? Yes, absolutely. So that setting is a scanner-based setting. It's the mobile device setting. It's on or off, irrespective of whether the count is a manual count or a scheduled count. Yeah. I think that is it. If there's no more questions, then I think we are pretty much done, and we 1 minute over. So I want to thank everybody again. We've got the next webinar on February the 4th. We'll continue to do these to share the knowledge of the software. The idea is that our clients become more and more self-sufficient in these things. Our partners also have a better understanding of the functionality and the logic that exists within the software. So I hope you found this session insightful, and thanks, Stephen, for your demonstration here.